Hey, Art 101ers. Wanted to do a little short video just to introduce the work of the four artists that we're going to talk about this week in our discussion. And so we'll start with Jeff Koons. We'll also see Damien Hirst and Aaron Toole and, of course, Banksy. Here we see Jeff Koons with his Michael Jackson and Bubbles, one of his famous and controversial statues. You can see it's from 1988. I got to see a big show of his at the San Francisco Museum of Art in '88, and that show actually also included one of his earlier works, which is the three-ball tank, as we knew it back then. As you can see, it's a very sort of simple sculpture. It looks like a big fish tank with some basketballs floating in it. Although I will point out, and this is one of the things I like about this, is that they very carefully salinate the water so that it makes the basketballs look what they're bouncing. They're floating. They're exactly on their equators, right? Exactly halfway through. So it's actually a much more complicated little sculpture than it may appear. However, most of his early work were inspired, if you will, by Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. And one of his major early works was these presentations of these vacuum cleaners, which were bought at the time brand new. And built in these cases and then presented in the gallery. And so right from the beginning, Koons was a bit of a controversial figure, much like Duchamp was. Koons, however, had another problem, which of course was that not only was his work sort of this ready-made thing, but it might have been a little more derivative of Duchamp's work, at least according to Jonathan Jones. As you can see here, he says that Koons's message is, you can get away with anything. He calls these things attacks on art. But think about that. That's reminiscent of what Duchamp wanted to do, right? Duchamp didn't want to make art. He wanted to end art. But Jones argues that Koons is telling us that we're an idiot for even looking at them, right? Here's the Dadaism without anger, without any purpose except to replace all the boring old paintings and drawings that artists used to make with a product as slick in its message as the most brazen of advertisements. And so Koons's work, you can see here, he continues to say, the total absence of emotion empties this art of all pleasure. It is sterile. It is hateful. You can see Koons's work elicits a fair amount of contempt, but he's still considered one of the most important and major sculptors of our day. You can see that his work is very purposely reflects some of the work of the past thematically as well. In fact, here he's doing polychrome wood sculpture, so he's reflecting the materials that artists like Domenia used in Spain that we saw earlier as well. In fact, this is from an image from a postcard that he bought at a store that he reproduced. And it turns out that the image was copyrighted, so the original copyright owner, the photographer who made that image, ended up suing Koons and winning for copyright infringement. Another polychrome wood sculpture. Remember, it means it's a wood sculpture. It's painted wood. And again, the difference, of course, is that when Domenia was doing it, he was a reverent subject like Christ's suffering, and Jeff Koons sculpts for us a poodle. Should be aware as well that Koons didn't actually sculpt it, right? He devised the idea and he sent it off to craftsmen in Italy who actually made the piece for him. And that's another big issue that we'll talk about with Jeff Koons. Same for something like this. Rabbit is obviously meant to look like a mylar balloon, the kind that we have for kids' birthday parties and stuff, but it's actually cast stainless steel. So I always find these objects rather interesting. Here's another larger one, balloon dog. Because there is sort of a visual pun going on, right? They seem to be these sort of lighter than air things, but they're actually extraordinarily heavy. But once again, these things are manufactured for him. Unlike Domenia, who sculpted Christ with his own two hands, Koons doesn't sculpt with his own two hands. And we're going to actually see a video of him in his studio at work, managing, I guess. Another one of his sculptures of Plato. This is all you deserve, the Koons seem to be saying to us. All that work, all that expense, just for a painstakingly perfect mound of kid stuff. As I mentioned, Koons, like many artists, likes to reflect on artworks of the past. In this case, quite literally, we see our beloved Hercules whom we're familiar with from ancient Greek times, here with a reflecting ball on his shoulder, the gazing ball, Koons calls it. He manufactures, reproduces works of classic art and adds this Jeff Koons-like blue ball to them so that we can see ourselves looking at his work. We can look at his work and see ourselves looking at the sculpture, I think is how he describes it that way. And by the way, if that's a familiar motif for you, if you're a Gaga fan, you might notice that one of those gazing balls is on her album cover. And the reason is because she hired Koons to make that cover for her, commissioned him to do it. So you can see here's a shot from the photo shoots that they did. And that brings us to Damien Hirst, who is influenced by Koons and readily admits that. Was an admirer of Koons when he was a younger artist. So Hirst, you're going to see, has similar strategies as Koons does. Here, probably his most famous work, Damien Hirst, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Limerick, right? A very complicated, sophisticated title for what is essentially a tiger shark, used to be real live tiger shark in a big formaldehyde tank. And you can see it's about a 13-foot shark. Here the gallery goers are admiring it. And that's a work of art, according to Damien Hirst. And according to Stephen Cohn, who paid $8 million for it. Interestingly, the shark began to rot, so Hirst had to get another shot. Now, of course, Damien Hirst didn't build a live tiger shark. He commissioned hired a fishing boat in Australia to go catch him one. And the fishing boat caught a shark, gave it to Hirst. Hirst put it in the formaldehyde and sold it to Stephen Cohn for $8 million. Turns out he had to go hire the boat again and get another shark for Cohn's work. I'm really mad at Stephen Cohn, by the way, because he just bought the New York Mets, my favorite beloved team as a child, and I'm not sure I am happy that Stephen Cohn owns something I love so much. So Hirst did a series of these works throughout his career that are these really sort of strange sort of scientific experiments gone amok, it seems like. And the second most famous work is For the Love of God, which is a platinum cast of an actual human skull that is then festooned in an actual embedded diamonds. And he didn't actually make this work initially. He told everybody that he would make it for them if they fronted the money. And it remained on sale for a period of time. And finally, an investment group offered him $100 million. And when he did that, Hirst went out and bought all those diamonds. Yes, that's 8,600 actual diamonds on that. It's known to be the most expensive work of art in terms of the materials, the actual materials it's made out of. It's not worth the most. For instance, the Mona Lisa, as we talked about before, is probably worth nearly $1 billion. But if you were to sell it for scrap, for the canvas and the paint, right, it would probably only bring you 20, 50 bucks, right? Literally, this piece of art, outside of any artistic value, is worth, I seem to remember it was like 30 or $40 million worth of diamonds in there. So it's a very interesting work of art in that way. So we're going to change gears now and look at Aaron Toole's work. Again, you've read an article about Aaron Toole in the New York Times, and so you know he makes cups. And there's a picture of him on one of his cups. That young Marine on the far right is actually Aaron Toole's official Marine Corps portrait from when he was a kid. As you know, Toole served in the first Gulf War, was honorably discharged, and his work is heavily influenced by what happened to him during his service and his return to the world. And again, that's Aaron Toole on the far left in Iraq in 1991, taken while he was in combat in Iraq. Here's some of the thousands of cups that he's made throughout his career. And I don't remember how specific they talked about it in that particular article, but I can tell you I was pretty good friends with Aaron. We were both young artists working at University of California, Berkeley, where he still works. And he made cups all day long. So he has hundreds and hundreds, thousands, probably made about 15,000 cups by now. And they're very quickly made, very roughly made, as you can see here, all festooned with these little designs. They often used toy soldiers and pressed them into the clay when it was wet, things like that, right? But what happened is, in his case, 2,500 cups in 2001, he says. 20,500 cups, I should say. He says, I'm compelled to make work that talks about strange places where the military and civilian cultures collude and collide. And that brings us to his openings. In an image like this, you can see what a typical Aaron Toole a gallery exhibit looks like. And what usually happens in gallery exhibits is that they have what's called an opening, right? Or an artist reception. Typically the first night that the show is open, and the artist is there, and they serve food and wine, and people come and they can talk to the artist and meet the artist. And it's really a great way to sell work. In fact, most work that's sold in galleries tends to be sold during the opening reception, right? Because people come in and want to see if they like the artist and see if they like what he's doing, and then they buy the stuff right there. Well, Aaron doesn't have openings. He has closings. So rather than the first night of the exhibit, he waits till the last night, right? And they have the same party, and you get to see him and talk to him and stuff. But then, when the gallery is closing up, or that last night, he'll walk up to one of these shelves that he builds on the gallery wall. He'll pick up a cup, and he'll give it to you. He'll give it to you as a gift for coming to the show. So you leave with a work of art just like that person who bought that work of art at the beginning of the night, but of course he gives it to you as a gift. And that's a big aspect of his work, right? He talks about the idea of that the gesture, that generous gesture of giving you the gift is really what makes this work important to him. He says it this way. He says, I believe the cup is an appropriate scale, and I love that idea, right? The scale of the artwork, right? It's like it's this personal, intimate scale. I hand it to you. You know, it might have a refreshing beverage in it, right? And these are all functional cups. You can actually drink out of them. The cups go into the world hand to hand, and of course, there's an allusion to a military terminology there. But he uses them. He feels like that handing of a gift is the way that people start having meaningful conversations, and he wants us to have meaningful conversations about these issues that he's experienced firsthand, right? And I think it's a remarkable and a powerful way to use an art practice for real communication. And of course, it sits exactly opposite of artists like Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst, right? Who sell their work for exorbitant amount of money. So they still want it to mean something and be important to you, but they don't give it to you. And that's and either one is fine, but I really do want to talk about the idea of why we pay money for work, how more importantly how we assign value to work. Just give you a couple more images of Aaron's work, and we'll get on and we'll start talking about, I think, another interesting. As you can see, he makes all sorts of elaborate designs on them. And we'll finish up with one of my favorite quotes of his, asking about if he would. A journalist actually asked him if these were considered sort of memorials to some way to war, and he answered that peace is the only adequate war memorial. And he also likes to tell journalists who are asking probing questions about the meaning of his work that he's just the guy who makes cups. And so I always like this cup for that reason. And that brings us to our last artist, Banksy. And Banksy's kind of an interesting in-between because he's famous for starting as an artist who gave his work away in a way that made it available to the public, like Aaron Toole, or perhaps more even like Jean-Claude and Christo, where he just put it out in public so that people could come upon it and enjoy it. But he later did start selling in galleries, and we'll sort of look at that shift. Banksy is an anonymous artist. We know it's a man because we've seen him dressed up in his disguises and stuff, but he sounds like a man, at least, either from the thing, and you've seen a video of his already. But his work is stenciled in a graffiti style onto walls, and it has a very particular style. As you can see, both it's typically politically or socially motivated work, but it also has this kind of strange, kind of ironic humor to it. So he uses both of those elements. He uses that kind of visual pun or humor to kind of get his point across. I think in a very powerful way, especially when you think about, much like Jean-Claude and Christo's work, you pass this wall every day, you're going to work, and then one day, up comes this iconic image and you recognize the style and you go, oh my gosh, that's a Banksy, So it transforms the world, the ordinary world around you with this powerful message that he's trying to convey. The worth of, we talk about the value of work, and Banksy's work, of course, is very interesting. Sorry, I pressed the button too fast there. The value of his work is very interesting because he sprays it on a wall like a graffiti artist, and then he walks away. So it's there for free, but some people realize that maybe that makes that wall very valuable, right? And there are all sorts of stories about him painting something on a garage door and people seeing a Banksy on the garage door, and then the next night the person who owns the house wakes up and finds their garage door has been stolen that night. Somebody knocked it off its rails and threw it in the back of a truck because there was a Banksy on it. There are other stories. If you're not familiar with that lightning bolt motif, it's from the I keep pressing the button accidentally, sorry, from the David Bowie record. So comparing the Queen to a character like David Bowie is a bit naughty in England. As you see, one of Banksy's popular themes is anti-capitalism. And it's interesting to look at Banksy's work now because many of these were made 10, 15 years ago. And obviously he's dealing with social issues that are very much alive and in play today. And I was thinking about this one, on the opposite hand, sometimes Banksy paints stuff on your wall and you get mad because some graffiti artist paints stuff on your wall and you paint over it. So the debate about how valuable a Banksy is on your wall it's a rather interesting one. It really matters, I guess, depends on who you ask. One of the nice things he does is that when he recognizes a charity or a struggling organization or something, he quite often goes in the middle of the night and paints them a mural. In other words, hoping that they can get some value out of it and that can draw attention to the program or to the nonprofit and hopefully get them some help in that way. So he's a very magnanimous in his creative work that way as well. He'll often travel to places where he feels a message is necessary. This is actually done in the south of France, if I remember correctly. Oh no, maybe based on the language there, it might actually, this one might be in Israel, but this is when the refugee crises were going on because of the conflicts in Syria, and he drew a picture of Steve Jobs to remind people that Steve Jobs was in fact an immigrant refugee, or his parents were at least, and that the common disparagements against refugees certainly are not true. There you go. As I said, a lot of his work is quite timely. I'll show you a few more of images, and these are images. Whoops, these are images that he made when he moved into the galleries. He finally went into gallery practice where he'd sort of sell his work, and of course we've seen what he does there. He's a bit of a prankster still, but he's an interesting character that way because you see often artists make choices like Christo and Aaron Toole have, and then you see artists who just have always made a living selling their artwork, and again, there's nothing wrong with that. Banksy is one that sort of changed for some reason, and there's a lot of talk and questioning about why he did that, a lot of criticism about doing that, and so that's one of the things we'll talk about, but we'll use his work. This, by the way, is the original that wall mural that he would make and put in various locations. And of course, eventually he started printing it on paper and selling it. And that brings us to that question. We saw that video as part of our lesson leading up to this week. That, should auction houses like Christie's be responsible for assigning value to a work of art? And where does artistic expression fit into the capitalist concept of property? These are questions that Banksy asks, of course, in his work, but I think they're the ones that I really want to sort of have you think about as we move into our discussion this Wednesday. We'll ask questions some about this. And really the bottom line question will be that, right? How do we decide in this day and age to define if a work of art is good or bad? In the case of somebody like Koons, or how valuable it is in the case of like Koons or Hirst, or compared to Toole or Banksy that way. So think about those ideas, and we're going to show you a little bit more stuff to begin the class, and we'll have our conversation this week.